Romeo Phillion was the longest-serving prisoner in Canadian history to have a murder conviction overturned. He was wrongly accused for the murder of Leopold Roy in 1967, which would follow him for the rest of his life. Romeo was born on April 29, 1939 in Cobalt, Ontario, and was the fourth of 9 children, one of whom was his identical twin. His mother was a housewife and his father worked at a dry cleaning business. Although a seemingly normal family, Phillion's father was an alcoholic who would abuse, sexually, physically, and mentally, Romeo and assumingly his other siblings. At the age of 8, his parents sent him to a training school for orphans and truants run by a Christian order in the hopes that this would turn him into a respectable young man. However, the opposite seemed to have occurred. Romeo grew into what they called a shiftless driver. He learned to live by his wits, lying and committing petty crimes to survive and surrounding himself with other criminals. In doing so, he compiled a criminal record of his own that included convictions relating to prostitution, theft, and assault. These would prove to be aggregating factors that placed Phillion at a murder scene years later. On August 9, 1967, a firefighter named Leopold Roy was stabbed to death in an apartment building by an unknown assailant in Ottawa, Ontario. He was at home with his wife Mildred when she noticed a man creeping through their house. She called for her husband, who ran and tried to catch the attacker, but instead received stab wounds just below his heart that would lead to his death. The police investigation began quickly, and with Mildred having witnessed the attack, she provided the police with a description of the assailant. On August 10th, Detective John McCombie of the Ottawa Police Department showed Mrs. Roy photographs of 10 different men, including pictures of Romeo Phillion and his identical twin brother Donald. Mrs. Roy picked Donald as the person she thought most resembled the attacker, but Donald was soon eliminated as a suspect after having confirmed he had been at work in a new Liskeard auto garage on August 9, 1967, the day of the murder. On August 13th, Romeo had been arrested on an unrelated charge and was brought into the police station. At this time, Mildred observed him again and said that, although she was not certain, she thought that Romeo resembled the man who had killed her husband. Since she could not make a positive identification, Romeo was released. Over the next 4.5 years, the police did not make any advances with the investigation into Leopold's death. The crime scene yielded no evidence and the murder weapon was never found. During this period, Mildred identified 3 other men whom she believed resembled her husband's killer, but police eventually released all 3 of the suspects without laying any charges. On January 11, 1972, Romeo was arrested again for an armed robbery of a taxi driver. Although this incident was completely unrelated to the murder of Leopold Roy, it was this interrogation that would lead to the false confession given by Romeo Phillion. Hunault, who was running the interrogation, was questioned by Phillion if his lover Neil had told the detective anything regarding the murder. The detective played along and responded that Neil had said a lot about the things he had bragged about to him. Upon hearing this, Romeo suddenly confessed to murdering the fireman. He explained that he had murdered Leopold many years ago and that he would make a full confession after being allowed to meet with Neil. His initial confession read as follows: "Well, I was with my girlfriend at the time and we got into an argument. Then I left her at her mother's. Then I drove around, looking for an apartment that I could go into to steal. I got into one apartment, looked around inside, in which I did not find any money. I had taken a knife from the kitchen of that apartment, going down the back stairs. I noticed a man and a woman. The man started coming down at me. I stabbed him. From there, I ran to my car that was parked on Nelson Street and drove to the Rideau Tavern and had a few beers." The police allowed this and he signed his confession. Neil also informed the police that Romeo had made a similar confession to him 4 days prior to his arrest. Romeo's trial began soon after and was just one more step in the process of his wrongful conviction. The Crown built its case against Phillion on 3 key pieces of evidence, the first being Mildred's identification of Romeo as the man who had killed her husband, second being Romeo's confession to the crime, which he had given freely, and third was Romeo's early confession to Neil. The defense's theory of the case was that Romeo's personality, which was affected by antisocial personality disorder, prompted him to falsely confess to the crime. The defense led evidence from two experts that confirmed this antisocial personality disorder, and that Romeo had a propensity to lie and to invent stories to make him feel important. They believed his desire to feel important had prompted him to falsely confess to Leopold's murder. On the very night of his confession, Romeo had recanted his confession to another police officer. He explained that he was innocent and that he and his lover Neil had come up with a scheme to send the police on a wild goose chase that would allow them to collect the reward money from Neil's report of his false confession. Since this, Romeo has consistently maintained that he is innocent. Romeo's lawyer also pointed out that the police had lost pieces of evidence that should have been presented in the case, including a hair sample taken from Romeo, as well as fingernail scrapings, blood, and hair samples taken from Leopold. He asked the jury to look carefully at the lack of proper police investigation. However, the trial ended in a guilty verdict of life in prison with no parole eligibility for 10 years. Romeo attempted to appeal his conviction to the Ontario Court of Appeal, arguing that among many things, he had been deprived of the presumption of innocence to which all accused persons are entitled. This appeal was dismissed on September 3, 1974. He then appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, but again on March 22, 1977, this appeal was dismissed. After two failed attempts at appeal, he began writing letters to the Minister of Justice, stating that he had been out of town at the time of Leopold's murder and asking that his case be reopened, but no action was taken. At this point, any hopes at exoneration and the truth had been lost. More than 20 years after Phillion's conviction, in 1998, his parole officer gave him an envelope containing police reports from his Corrections Canada file. One of the documents included was a police investigation report that had been prepared on April 12, 1968 by the investigating officer Detective McCombie. This report appeared to provide Romeo with an alibi. It had shown that Detective McCombie had spoken to a Trenton service station operator who confirmed that Romeo had been in Trenton between 12 and 1 p.m. on August 9th, the day of Leopold's murder, therefore making it impossible for him to return to Ottawa by 2:45 p.m. at the time the murder was committed. This possible alibi had never been raised in trial. Romeo forwarded this report to Innocence Project at Osgoode Hall Law School, and together with Innocence Canada, they submitted a Section 696.1 application for ministerial review to determine whether Romeo's conviction was a miscarriage of justice. Section 696.1 of the Criminal Code of Canada gives the Minister of Justice the power to review a conviction under federal law to determine whether there may have been a miscarriage of justice, or in other words, a wrongful conviction. If the review indicates this has occurred, the Minister of Justice has the authority to order a new trial or to refer the matter to the Court of Appeal for the province or the territory in question. There are 4 stages to this process. The first stage is the preliminary assessment. Here, each case is evaluated to ascertain whether new and significant information has become available. The second stage is the investigation. Here, a lawyer closely examines the new information provided in the application to determine whether or not it is reliable and relevant. The third stage is the investigation report. It is prepared and summarizes all of the information gathered. The fourth and final stage is the decision. This occurs once the minister has reviewed all the materials and decides whether the application should be dismissed or allowed. While the Minister of Justice considered the application, Romeo was awarded bail after he had spent 31 years in prison. It is interesting to note that during his time in prison, Romeo was able to apply for parole much sooner, but had refused to do so because he felt that applying for parole would be equal to admitting that he killed Leopold. It is also likely that even if Romeo did apply for parole, he would not receive it as he maintained his innocence. This is largely due to the fact that parole relies heavily on the existence of remorse. A show of remorse is an affirmation that the institutions that impose punishment did so with cause. But from the standpoint of the convicted, any show of remorse subverts their claim to innocence. As a result of this, the wrongfully convicted are designated as persons who lack remorse and are differentiated from those characterized as having remorse. On August 2, 2006, the Minister of Justice ordered that the Ontario Court of Appeal reopen Romeo's case. The judges heard evidence to determine that Detective McCombie's 1968 report giving Romeo an alibi that had never been disclosed to his lawyer. They concluded that the Crown had not intentionally pursued their case against him knowing that he was innocent. As well, the majority found that there was a great deal of confusion surrounding whether and when the police learned further information that discredited this alibi. Detective McCombie testified that after submitting this report, he had retrieved tow records of Romeo's car showing that he could actually have made it back to Ottawa in time to have killed Roy. However, there was no evidence backing this up. Justice Moldaver, who was the judge in this case, overturned Romeo's conviction and ordered a new trial. The Crown, however, withdrew the murder charge on April 29, 2010, since there was no reasonable chance that the new trial would result in his conviction, and on April 29th, his 71st birthday, Romeo Phillion's name was cleared. Phillion's wrongful conviction came about due to a number of factors, but the major three contributors were a false confession, a disorganized police investigation, and eyewitness misidentification. The greatest factor that led to Phillion's wrongful conviction was his voluntary false confession. There was no coercion or threatening tactics used to extract this confession. It was completely voluntary, which made it very hard for officials to believe that he had made it up. No innocent man can be supposed to be willing to risk life, liberty, or property by a false confession. Because of this, courts typically attach tremendous importance to them, and it makes false confessions to be one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions. The defense lawyers called expert testimony on the psychology of false confessions by Dr. Goodjohnson. He argued that Phillion's false confession arose from antisocial personality disorder, as well as borderline personality disorder, and that interaction of these two conditions might have led to him making the false confession. He also explained that voluntary confessions are common in high-profile cases such as Roy's unsolved murder case and can be motivated by many factors including a desire for notoriety, fueled by pathological needs to be infamous or draw attention to themselves, an unconscious need to expiate guilt over unrelated transgressions, an inability to distinguish fact from fantasy, a desire to aid and protect someone else, typically the real criminal. Romeo's lawyer suggested that his confession was a desperate mid to protect Neil from other charges. Finally, it could be revenge. Romeo stated during his recantation that he wanted to get even with the police and send them on a wild goose chase. However, Phillion stated that his primary motivation for making the false statement had been to ensure his lover Neil did not get into trouble. Another factor contributing to Romeo's wrongful conviction was the fact that the police investigation was incredibly disorganized. Police officers frequently lost evidence and failed to keep records of their investigations, as seen with the DNA evidence and the hiding of Romeo's possible alibi. Unlike in 1972 when this case occurred, Crown prosecutors are now required to disclose every relevant document to the defense. McCombie, the leading detective, concluded in his subsequent report that, "We do not believe that Romeo Phillion is responsible for this murder." Surprisingly enough, this report vanished, as did much other evidence, including McCombie's notebooks, a knife that may have been in the murder weapon, and some hair and tissue found under the victim's fingernails. No one in the defense trial were even aware of McCombie's exculpatory report until it mysteriously surfaced in Phillion's prison cell. Eyewitness misidentification is another factor leading to Phillion's wrongful conviction. Eyewitness misidentifications are the single most common cause of wrongful convictions and among the least reliable forms of evidence. Mrs. Roy's identification of Romeo was weighed heavily by the jury, and they placed too much emphasis on it, despite the fact that even she herself noted that she wasn't 100% sure. Eyewitness identification presented from well-meaning citizens is highly persuasive and highly regarded by juries. Although not explicitly mentioned as a contributing factor, Phillion's marginalization in different aspects of his life may have been a cause. His sexuality as a bisexual man, his lower-class status, and his life associated with crime resulting in a criminal record made him a very vulnerable individual. Due to all of these factors, and Phillion's refusal to seek parole and accept responsibility for a crime that he did not commit, Romeo is the longest-serving innocent Canadian to have a murder conviction overturned. In May 2013, Romeo was denied the right to sue for compensation by Superior Court Justice Eva Frank, but that decision was overturned on appeal, and ultimately the Supreme Court gave him the right to proceed with his civil case. However, Romeo passed away on November 2nd, 2015 without ever receiving compensation. The one thing Phillion did receive before his death was a formal apology.
It's a beautiful day. The judge has apologized for the wrongful thing happened, and I'm so happy. Waited 30 years for this.
Lawyer James Lockyer lost his bid to have Phillion arraigned and speedily acquitted of the murder charge, but he said that what Ratushny did made up for all that.
You know, I came here with my head down a bit. I was anxious about it, but I'm really pleased what Justice Ratushny did. It was just great for Romeo, and it was great for the administration of justice.
During his short life after prison, Romeo was a great supporter of others who too were wrongly convicted. He made himself available to attend their court hearings and to encourage and listen to them. He understood the trauma and pain of being wrongfully convicted, and having going through this himself, he was the perfect person to offer a helping hand. He is the perfect example of how the justice system can go wrong, and it is important to view cases like his in order to learn for the future and how to avoid wrongs like his.